Welcome back to Clever Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Sopral with the Science Collaborative. So glad to see so many people joining and using the chat function. It is great to see everybody. Today's webinar features a huge effort to engage all current reserves across the country to identify the extent and spatial patterns of estuary habitat loss through habitat change analyses. And you'll hear from some folks on the project team in just a moment. But before we get started, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items and an intro to the reserve system, the Science Collaborative program, and this webinar series. So with that, we'll just jump right in. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. It is a national network of 30 unique research reserves as shown on this map. It's a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit at each site. Each reserve includes programs focused on the activities you see on the slide here. So those are land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training, programs for the public and local officials, and education. And the Science Collaborative program supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. The webinar series features project teams like today's, supported by the Science Collaborative program. Program staff and partners, speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuary management issues. And if that sounds interesting to you, and if this is your first time joining us today, please do feel free to join us for future webinars to learn more about how these methods can be integrated into your own work. Okay, so a quick note on housekeeping. We are in Zoom today, so all attendees were muted on entry as with normal webinar series webinars. We're going to be using the Q&A feature to field questions related to the presentations. You can drop those in at any time. Presenters will be kind of monitoring that throughout the presentation as well, so they'll try to respond to questions that are in that Q&A section. And people can build off each other's questions as well, so feel free to just keep commenting on those threads. We'll leave them open so you can keep commenting on the webinar as it goes on. If you want to chat amongst yourselves, as I mentioned at the beginning, and as people are already doing, feel free to chat amongst yourselves. It's open to everybody, so use that feature to engage and socialize a little bit. If you have any technical questions or support questions that you need help from the Science Collaborative organizer program staff, just feel free to chat us directly in the chat function. So with that, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome back Kerstin Wasson, a familiar face. And she is the research coordinator at the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve and served as the PI for this project. Kerstin is passionate about science-based conservation and restoration of estuaries and complements local place-based work in coastal California with syntheses across the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. Kerstin, I'll pass it over to you so you can take over.
Thank you, Nick. So welcome everybody to this presentation on estuaries, past, present, and future. Here's a little roadmap to our talk today. We'll start by telling you why we did this work. We'll spend quite a bit of time on how we did it, and then we'll end up with the most exciting part, which is what did we learn? So starting with the why, estuaries are treasures. They provide many important ecosystem services and functions. So we can all agree that estuaries merit conservation action, but what exactly should we protect and restore? It turns out that estuary boundaries can be murky. The extent of the estuary is not often that clear, especially in the upper reaches. But you really need to know where the estuary starts and stops in order to protect it, say, from development. There can also be a shifting baselines problem. This is from Elkhorn Slough, NERR, the estuary where I work, and looks like an agricultural ditch that you might not prioritize for restoration, but historical detective work reveals this to be the river that feeds our estuary. This is the Salinas River channel as it flows into Elkhorn Slough, and it once was a grand channel that merits restoration and conservation. So we need to understand estuarine habitat change. Estuaries are considered the most altered ecosystems on Earth. Again, with my Elkhorn estuary example, you can see hydrological alterations to the mouth, a harbor, a power plant, and farming. Here's some farm fields in former salt marsh. in the last century, right near where the ESNER offices are. I want to point out that these major alterations almost entirely occurred following European colonization of the US. Native Americans have interacted with estuaries for millennia, stewarding their resources sustainably. I'd like to acknowledge that the wetlands we'll be talking about today represent unceded ancestral lands of a diversity of tribes. A priority of the National Estuarine Reserve System is to serve as better allies to tribes and support their efforts to continue this legacy of coastal stewardship. So we want to understand trajectories of change. Knowing where habitats were and where they're headed is essential for planning for sea level rise, including supporting migration of valued habitat types. So the goals of our estuarine mapping were, simply put, to understand where our estuaries are, were, and could be. One objective of this was to enhance conservation planning, to improve protection by providing better maps, and to detect currently disconnected parts of the former estuary that could be reconnected. There really is a national need for estuarine planning tools. For instance, as the NERRs make use of infrastructure funding to conduct restoration across the reserves. We also wanted to build support for restoration and climate adaptation with both national and local stakeholders. Our products help educate stakeholders about estuary dynamics and highlight restoration needs and concrete opportunities for it. So that was the why. Now moving on to the how, except I'll sort of start by telling you who. All the core work, the mapping for this project was conducted by our technical co-leads, Charlie, Suzanne, and Andrea, and you'll hear from each of them shortly. They were supported in the mapping by a diverse array of mapping advisors who each contributed vital support, but I wanted to particularly highlight Laura Brophy. She has a purple box because she was part of our core team and really shaped every part of our project. At the 30 NERR estuaries, a point of contact helped with this work, and I see many of you here today, thank you. And then on our core team, we had a few NERR members who contributed more heavily to shaping the project. Dan Brumbaugh served as our collaborative lead to develop products and was supported by an advisory committee. And I see many of you here today too, thank you. And then we had some product subcontractors who prepared some of our beautiful products, Roca Plus Communications and Monica Almeida. This was a national project in scope. We mapped the estuaries associated with all 30 NERRs. And so that allowed us to conduct national syntheses, but also to compare among regions, as shown by the color coding here. The NERRs really serves as an ideal platform for this sort of work because they have staff expertise in monitoring, in mapping, and in stewardship of these national trust resources. So what this project was about was exploring alternatives to mapping with aerial imagery. Probably most maps of estuaries you've looked at are based on visual interpretation of aerial photos. One example of that is the National Wetland Inventory, which we used in this study and many of you have used. It's a consistent data source generated by the US Fish and Wildlife Service for wetlands across the US. And their maps are primarily based on interpretation of aerial images, such as this one of Elkhorn Slough. So you can map where the estuarine habitats are based on interpretation of the aerial imagery. Our approach was to use two different mapping methods for this: elevation-based mapping and historical mapping. And I'll just run through a quick contrast among these. The elevation-based mapping we conducted at a larger spatial scale than the historical mapping. Elevation-based mapping focuses on estuary extent, while historical mapping tells you about the types of habitats within the estuary. Elevation-based mapping simply tells you what's within the reach of tides, and that's relevant for understanding past and present estuaries, or within the reach of water levels for the Great Lakes. The historical mapping is one snapshot of a particular period in the past. Since both methods are useful for understanding the past, we compared them to each other within the smaller footprint of the historical map. And we compared both to the National Wetland Inventory that I mentioned earlier. So this is an overview of our approach. You're now going to hear more about the methods for elevation-based and then for historical mapping. So now I will turn it over to Charlie Endres from Moss Landing Marine Labs, who works on behalf of the Elkhorn Slough NERR, who will tell you about the elevation-based mapping.
Thank you, Kirstine. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about the elevation-based mapping approach that we used in High Tider. Specifically, this work was pioneered initially by Laura Brophy in her 2019 study of wetland loss in the West Coast estuary. So I encourage you to check out that study if you get a chance. In the background here, I'm showing Elkhorn Slough. That's my home estuary, the one I'm most familiar with. And so for the next several slides, in fact, I'll be using Elkhorn Slough as my base map to show you some examples. So talking about elevation-based mapping obviously requires discussion of topographic data sets. And we are using digital elevation models for the base of our work. These were DEMs for short. These were compiled by NOAA for their sea level rise viewer. They were sourced from a mosaic of different LiDAR data sets across the country. You can see them along the West Coast and the East Coast here. The exceptions would be Alaska and the Great Lakes, where we had to dig up some individual LiDAR data sets to use for those areas. So we would take these DEMs and we combine them with water level data that we extracted from the tide stations, the NOAA tide stations along the coasts, as well as an Army Corps of Engineers study in the Northeast. And we use this combination to create layers showing the maximum estuary extent. And this would be in the absence of any water control structures. And I just want to point out that in the Great Lakes, obviously that would refer to the average maximum lake levels in the Great Lakes. So as an example here, you can see Elkhorn Slough on the right. These higher tides would be in the light blue color. That would be up to about 2.2 meters NAVD88, down to the subtidal, which would be those dark blues. So we would take these DEMs, like you show here, this coverage, and we would convert those to vector layers. And these vector layers would be referred to as our elevation-based estuary extent. Now, if we take a closer look at some of this in Elkhorn Slough, we can see how well that elevation-based estuary extent lines up with where you see areas of the marsh versus the uplands, particularly in these areas that have been isolated from the tides by dikes and levees, as you can see in this area here. So again, this elevation-based estuary extent, this becomes our foundation, or otherwise known as our mask, for extracting the classified wetlands data from NWI. So what we're showing here now are the grouped NWI habitats within that same footprint of our elevation-based mapping. So these NWI codes, I think there's over 5,000 of them nationally, so we wanted to distill them down to a more manageable number. So I'm showing these 7 here. For the remainder of the talk, though, I just want to focus on these top 4, these tidal wetlands identified within NWI. So if we go to the next slide, these 4 colors are going to turn green. And so this color scheme is going to be used on the next several slides. So just to orient you to that, the green, again, would be these areas where NWI has identified tidal wetlands within our elevation-based mapping estuary extent. Areas in pink would be areas where NWI identified wetlands, but we did not using the elevation-based mapping. Areas in blue would be zones that were mapped by our team within the elevation-based mapping extent, but not by NWI. So theoretically, some of these areas in blue could represent areas of wetland loss. However, that's not always the case. It's possible that these could be tidal wetlands that are just simply missing from NWI. So I'm going to show you some examples around the different areas of the United States. But first, I want to just show you how we can take these areas and we can look at them on a national scale to see some patterns beginning to emerge. Particularly on the West Coast, we can see examples of real wetland loss, these areas in blue, versus in the Gulf of Mexico, where we have this mixed bag of results. And some of this can be due to limitations in the mapping. So I'm going to show you 2 end members of these different results in the mapping. First, I'll start up here in Padilla Bay. Here we can see very clear examples of estuary loss in these areas of blue that we mapped within the tidal extent, and what they are today. These are these farm areas behind levees and dikes. So you can see that they're clearly within this zone of elevation-based mapping. And so this would represent areas of loss. If we move over to Apalachicola Bay in the Gulf, we can see these extensive areas that are mapped in the northern parts of this estuary. If we zoom in close, you can see these are tidal wetlands. And you can see this straight line here in green. This is a clearing indication of where NWI did not map it consistently. So this would be an example of where we identified elevation-based mapping to be within these tidal wetlands, but NWI did not. So we couldn't necessarily call this as lost tidal wetlands because they're still functioning as tidal wetlands. Another example would be in Grand Bay. You can again see one of these straight line examples up in the northern part of the bay where there is likely tides reaching those areas. This is due to some of the NWI mapping that was done in the early 80s versus NWI mapping that was done later on, more recently in 2007. So this would be another example where NWI just simply did not capture these tidal wetlands in the northern part of the bay. But there's another example down here in the lower part of the bay, in Grand Bay, where we can see the pink, and these pink areas would represent areas that NWI did map as tidal wetlands, but elevation-based mapping did not, likely due to a positive bias in the LIDAR. So that would be dense vegetation, such as black needle rush, intercepting that LIDAR signal and causing some limitations in our elevation-based mapping. So to just sum up, the elevation-based mapping is an effective tool for identifying the full extent of tidal wetlands, but both NWI and elevation-based mapping can contain errors, as I showed you, but together they do provide a more accurate map of the estuary. So now we're going to move on to Andrea Woolfolk, who is our historical mapping guru here at Elkhorn Slough, and she is going to lead you through the historical mapping in the High Tider project.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll be talking about how we did the historical map part of our project, which was headed up by Suzanne Schall and me. Suzanne and I worked with U.S. Coast Survey topographic sheets, which are also known as T-sheets, and U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers lake surveys. These are maps of the U.S. coastline or Great Lakes. There are several versions of these surveys for any given site, so our team worked with staff from each National Estuarine Research Reserve to pick the earliest T-sheet or lake survey that appeared useful for their reserve. Our final 30 surveys dated between 1842 and 1926. I'm going to show you 3 examples. This first one is a detail from Ace Basin's 1852 T-sheet from South Carolina. I'm going to explain most of the symbols later, but I hope the big open tidal channels in this map jump out at you here. Now let's go up to the coast to Maine and the Wells Reserve to a T-sheet that was made in 1869. Here you might be able to see the extensive tidal marshes, which are shown with parallel lines, behind sand dunes or beaches, which are shown with dots towards the bottom of this map. And then finally, let's head to the Great Lakes. This 1861 Lake Superior map definitely has similar symbols to the T-sheets, but includes some cool bathymetry too, with depths and sediment types shown. So most of the surveys we used were created in the mid-1800s, and to get these beautiful color and high-resolution versions, we relied heavily on the National Archives to scan the original maps. Everything that we collected for this project is available online, and we're going to share those links with you a little bit later in this talk. So although together these maps cover all of the U.S. coastline and the Great Lakes, each individual survey is relatively small. Since we only used one T-sheet or lake survey per reserve, the historical mapping analysis was smaller than the elevation analysis that Charlie just described. So here's Elkhorn Slough's elevation-based analysis again. And here's Elkhorn Slough's 1854 T-sheet draped over that area. Hopefully you can see that the T-sheet includes quite a bit of blank space, and the surveyed habitats cover just the red box that I'm showing you here. And as you can probably intuit from this slide, after we acquired the high resolution color surveys, we geo-referenced them so we could use them in GIS software. So once these maps are in GIS, we can digitize the habitats shown in the surveys. But the surveys themselves lack legends. Luckily, there are two excellent resources for interpreting the data on these surveys. The first is specific to California. That one's on the left. That's the T-sheet user guide written by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. The other, Shore and Sea Boundaries, is very comprehensive, and it covers all of the methods used to create the T-sheets across the country. So here's one figure from Shore and Sea Boundaries, giving you a taste of the habitat, land use, and tidal lines that generally appeared in our surveys. This is for T-sheets, but the symbols are very similar for the Great Lakes, except for the tide lines. The tide lines here are depicted under the sand symbol towards the bottom. And here they show the separation between high and low water. The tidal datums used in T-sheets varied from map to map, but it was one of the most important pieces of information that the surveyors were tasked with mapping. So Suzanne and I used those legends to interpret what we saw in the surveys. This is an example of what I could see in just one portion of the Elkhorn Slough T-sheet. I've mentioned a few already, but let's review some of these. In California, dotted lines tended to show mean lower low water. We've already talked about the parallel lines showing tidal or salt marsh and dots showing sand. Almost always a thick solid line depicted the highest extent of tides, and above that in this map you see tufts of upland grass and a freshwater pond. Based on the tide lines, we can decipher where tide flats and salt pans were. Suzanne and I, along with Charlie and a few college students, traced mapped features in ArcGIS Pro at a scale of 1 to 2000, creating geodatabases. Each individual polygon was given a habitat name, but also given an NWI code, since the T-sheets and lake survey habitats line up very well with NWI habitats. In this particular case, you can see I ended up with 11 habitat categories for the Elkhorn Slough T-sheet, including things that I pointed out on the previous slide. Finally, Suzanne simplified the surveys, creating just a few umbrella habitat types for us, really focusing in on wetland habitats. You can see that in her version of the Elkhorn Slough T-sheet, which is on the left, and her simplified legend with just 5 habitat categories, not the 11 that I showed you on the previous slide. Then she compared the T-sheet habitats to the current NWI habitats, which are shown on the right here. Uplands in red are only used in these comparisons to show conversions over time. So here you see a lot of red on the right map where former tidal wetlands have been diked and drained, changing them from historic wetlands to uplands today. So I'm going to hand it off to Suzanne now. Suzanne Schaal is the GIS specialist for Padilla Bay, National Estuarine Research Reserve, and she has decades of experience using GIS in coastal Washington. She's going to tell you more about what you can do with all of this.
All right, thank you. I am just going to share with you some of the products. So we anticipate this project's results would be useful to a spectrum of users, from education programs to conservation and restoration projects, as well as GIS users. So I'm going to step you through 6 of the products, as well as hopefully a live demonstration. The first product is a 20-page detailed description of the methods and the 2 mapping results, as well as how they compared, and quality control, value-added historical context from the knowledgeable local points of contact that we mentioned earlier. The 2-page overview brief, it was put together by Roca. It's based on these descriptive reports that provides an overview for working with restoration groups that may have people with different levels of expertise. Then we have the T-sheets, the scanned T-sheets that Andrea obtained from the National Archives, as well as descriptive reports when they were available to go with those in their unadulterated format. So these are pre-GIS processing, your beautiful products available for download. But for those who are GIS savvy, we do have all of our data in ArcGIS Online. You can use our web maps and apps, or you can add them as services to your own online maps. The geodatabases for each of the reserves data in their local UTM coordinates are available from our Coastal Data Management Office for download as a zip geodatabase, as well as a geo-referenced T-sheet for each one of those 30 reserves. So these methods are applicable across any terrain, depending upon the availability of the data. And so we'll be demonstrating the methods for both the elevation-based mapping as well as the historical habitat mapping and a workshop early next year. We'll cover the acquisition of the data, the processing of the data, analysis, as well as the comparison. So this next slide is the product that is the ring that binds all of the products together. And here I'd like to try to get out and go into a live demonstration. So Monica Almeida took the lead on compiling this story map. She works with our Tijuana River Reserve in San Diego. And it just gives you a general guide into the vision for the project, why we mapped the estuaries, and it continues on to share with you what, how they were mapped. Charlie and Andrea have already covered, but it also contains information about examples of how this data can be used. So there's examples for conservation as well as for education. And then there's also what we've learned. So I'm going to jump here to another important aspect of that story map, which is the reserve stories. So here Monica's created a web app for each one of the 30 reserves, and it presents all of the beautiful results and maps that were generated for each one of these reserves. So we'll take a little deeper dive and take a look at what Apalachicola's report looks like. These are beautiful photos, a generalized map, and some background information about the reserve, and then a short summary of what it was that we found. Not only that, but it has the original T-sheets that have been geo-referenced, and then the digitized habitats we developed from those T-sheets, how they've been grouped into tidal and non-tidal, vegetated and unvegetated categories for both the past and for the present. You can use a slider to compare those 2 generalized groups. And there's even a change map. So here the lime green are the tidal vegetated areas that have been retained. Yellow are the tidal unvegetated areas that have been retained. The bright green are unvegetated tidal areas that have become vegetated. And then the blue show areas perhaps tidal gain, and red is areas of tidal loss. But as you heard earlier, these may be the results of differences in the methodology. So take them with a caveat. There is also a section here on the elevation-based mapping and its comparison to the NWI. So in this example, The elevation-based data is the lime green, light blue, NWI in pink, overlapping area in green. And again, another slider to allow you to really get in and do a comparison of the two. So at the end of this stories, there are links back to some of the original products that I described in the beginning of this presentation, the 2-pager, as well as the reserve reports. So at this point, I will turn it over to Kirstine to tell you more about what we found.
Thank you. Get to my favorite part of the story, of course, though the products are amazing, but let me tell you what we actually learned from this project. And this will be in abbreviated form with just some highlights. We're working on a publication that will have more details. So our lessons learned that I'm going to run through will divide by temporal period, starting with the past. So as you've just seen from Andrea's and some of Suzanne's presentation, these historical maps are really treasure troves that shed light on past habitat distributions, as with this example of Padilla Bay's historical map. But what you may be more surprised to hear is that elevation-based mapping actually complemented this really well. So here's Padilla Bay again. And the area in green is that identified as estuarine by both elevation and the T-sheet. The area in yellow was only identified by the T-sheet because these are areas of wetland fill that are now above the reach of tides. So the historical map was better at identifying those. And then this blue area was not identified as estuarine in the T-sheet because it was already diked in 1886 when the T-sheet was drawn, but it was identified as part of the past estuary by elevation-based mapping. So in a sense, you get a deeper baseline from the elevation-based mapping. You also can get a broader spatial scale because anywhere you have a DEM, you can do elevation-based mapping and you can see how vast these blue diked areas are in the larger Padilla Bay area. Turning to the present, we found that elevation-based mapping reveals a larger estuary than NWI does. At almost all the tidal estuaries, we found that estuarine habitat was missed by NWI, and in many cases, these were really extensive areas, such as in the Apalachicola example that Charlie talked you through. Another key take-home message about the present was that tidal forests are often missed by NWI. At 82% of our tidal estuaries, we detected tidal forests missed by NWI. And in many cases, the points of contact on the ground were not that familiar with this habitat type either. Now turning to change. Originally, we had planned to conduct a quantitative change analysis comparing the elevation-based map as a sense of the past to NWI for estimating present conditions. This is what Laura Brophy did for hundreds of estuaries on the Pacific coast, and it was very successful. It worked great for our 4 estuaries along the mainland US Pacific coast, but at most of the estuaries on other coasts, NWI didn't accurately map the present estuary, so we couldn't use it for the change analysis we'd originally planned to conduct. So at 21 out of 28 tidal estuaries, we couldn't do a formal change analysis using elevation compared to NWI. But I'll show you what it looked like where we did do it. For the 4 Pacific Coast estuaries, we had an average of 74% loss of vegetated estuary extent. You can visualize that here with an example like Elkhorn Slough. The red areas are lost. For the other 3 estuaries, which were in a variety of places, there was an average of 7% loss, so an order of magnitude less loss of vegetated habitat. And sort of as a visualization of that, here's Great Bay, and you can barely see the little red areas of lost vegetated habitat. So Another way we could do a change analysis was to compare the T-sheet to NWI. While both often missed tidal forests, they were really good at mapping tidal marsh. And so we had a nice big sample size where we could do a change analysis comparing extent of tidal marsh in the T-sheet or historical map to NWI. And here is what we found. Let me orient you to this. On the y-axis, we have the percent change in tidal marsh extent. So the dashed line at 0 would mean that there's the same acreage of tidal marsh today as shown by NWI versus in the past as shown in the T-sheet. We've broken this up by the regions that are shown on the map here. And you can see right away that there's a strong regional contrast. The Pacific has lost over 60% of its tidal marshes. At the other extreme, on the Gulf Coast, there was a slight gain in tidal marsh extent. And in the other regions, there was some modest loss. So I don't know. Did you guys know this? We didn't know this, and we haven't found it in the literature. I think this is a pretty novel finding as a result of this study, that the Pacific has had so much greater loss of tidal marsh than other regions of the US. Moving on to the future, this project really helps us understand that tidal wetland extent can be restored, especially on the Pacific, where the lost portions of the estuary, those shown in red here for Elkhorn and Padilla Bay as examples, can be regained. And why does that matter? Because the more estuarine habitat there is, the more of those ecosystem services and values and functions that we care about. Another message from this project for the future is that tidal forests need a lot more attention. They really aren't well mapped and not well recognized by people on the ground, and they're at real risk of becoming ghost forests. We're seeing that happening already in some places, and more is on the way. I wanted to give you a few concrete examples, given the audience list. This could be very relevant to you, of what can be done with the products we've generated. This is an example from San Diego Bay, where habitat change and climate adaptation analyses were combined. This is not from our data, but could be done with a project like ours. San Francisco Estuary Institute and the NERR and other partners conducted an analysis. And I just want you to walk you through these bar graphs. On the far left is the historical habitat distribution. Focus on the green bar, that's the tidal marsh extent. Then you have the present, and you can see right away there's a lot less tidal marsh. Then there are some sea level rise scenarios, and with a lot of sea level rise, you lose marsh within that current footprint. But the next box shows what happens if you can allow for expansion of the marsh into higher ground, marsh migration, where you can regain some marsh. And if you allowed that into all the developed areas, which isn't realistic, but maybe you can get some of them, then you see you can get a regain of the former marsh extent. So this is a really nice example of how looking to the past can help you plan for the future. In another example from my estuary, our restoration is really motivated by an understanding of the past loss. So understanding how vast the past estuary was, that it wasn't just the area that's currently undiked, which is relatively small, but that much, much larger than that before it was diked and drained for agriculture. That has really helped us think big, and is why we are investing currently about $12 million in a big tidal marsh restoration project in a formerly diked area. Another example comes from Lake Superior NERR, where habitat mapping can be used to support a cultural service. Wild rice, or manumin, is really important to the Ojibwe people. And the historical T-sheet actually shows areas where wild rice was cultivated in the past, and those are restoration opportunities for the future. And in a final example from Elkhorn, you can use the maps and products generated to inform the public, such as we do at our visitor center. All right, so that was a crazy, complicated, and long webinar. I want to sum up for you 4 simple take-home messages that I think you can remember from this work. So if you remember nothing else, here are the 4 take-home messages. Number 1, multiple mapping methods complement each other and together are more accurate than any single approach. So by comparing T-sheets, elevation, and NWI, we got a really rich understanding of estuary dynamics. Second, temperate tidal swamps need a lot more attention, better mapping, and conservation measures. Third, there are really strong regional differences in how much tidal marsh has been lost. We can't have a national coastal resilience one-size-fits-all strategy. You're going to need really different approaches for, say, the Pacific and the Gulf Coast, regaining lost marshes versus maybe supporting migration. And finally, think big. Dare to have big dreams based on these sorts of visions. Our estuaries are bigger than we think they are, and they could be bigger still. So I hope we've convinced you that understanding where our estuaries are, were, and could be will help us take better care of them. And we didn't want to put the link to all our products in the chat before now because you get lost surfing in them. We wanted you listening to us, but now we will put the link to all our products in the chat. And we have time for some questions. So Dan Brumbaugh is going to help facilitate this, and the other panelists can turn their cameras back on. All right, Dan, I'll turn it over to you to moderate.
Sure. There's a couple of questions looking for clarification on the methods. One of them is whether you can clarify or go into more detail on why we couldn't do the formal change analysis with the NWI. Is there a way to remedy that?
So let me go back to some of our examples. The way we had planned to do the change analysis was to consider the areas that are not shown as estuarine in NWI, but are shown as estuarine by elevation to be lost. But in the case of Apalachicola, where Charlie showed you all the way back to his close-ups here, those examples, this is not lost estuarine habitat. It didn't suddenly stop being estuarine right at this point. It's just incorrectly mapped. So we couldn't do it with NWI. Many of these estuaries do have additional local maps, habitat maps they've generated where it would have been possible, but because we had a small staff and limited hours, we needed to use one nationally consistent product for all 30 estuaries, and we're reliant on NWI.
Great, thanks. And Laura Brophy also put a written response to that question too in the Q&A. So thanks, Laura. There's a question about were the tidal forests mostly identified only through elevation mapping? And somebody asked for sharing more about the lack of information you encountered for the tidal forests.
So we had the points of contact on the ground, as well as often there were like USGS tide gauges that showed that the tide rises and falls in this forest. In some cases also published literature about the habitat types or other analyses. So those are the types of sources we were using to double check that the forests that were within the reach of tides truly were tidal forests.
I would mention that the T-sheets did show tidal forests. It wasn't always perfect, so we couldn't totally rely on it, but the T-sheets did show tidal forests at quite a few sites.
There's a question about the Great Lakes, just maybe you could add a little bit more detail. They asked if we considered using sea water, I think I'm pronouncing that right, sea water level data in lieu of tidal data. So you guys want to comment on that?
I'll take that. So we focused on using the NOAA water level stations for that data because those data sets went back, I think, 50, 60 years. It was a really rich data set of information that we could average of those maximum water levels. Whereas I think we didn't come across as thorough a data set of SAISH water levels.
Great, thanks. Somebody asked whether we happened to examine what drove the losses that we saw across different regions of the country. So the differences in the pattern, the regional patterns. Did we look at the drivers for that?
I think that that gets called out kind of individually in the reports where we had the reserve point of contacts really explaining the patterns that we saw. So I think that's one place you can go see it, is where the local experts tell us what they think happened there. Kirsten, did we take kind of a broader view as well?
I think that's correct.
And then somebody asked about how these patterns that were observed scale up beyond the NERRs. Is there a possibility that this is an artifact of where the NERRs are located, or is it more general?
I mean,
Likely
my
to be more
answer
general.
to that would be that in general, the T-sheet areas of high loss were also places where the elevation-based mapping was showing high loss, like both had high loss on the West Coast. And the elevation-based mapping, the spatial scale went far beyond the NERR boundaries in many cases. Like, yeah, Wells NERR in Maine is tiny, but we looked at the whole, or New Hampshire NERR is, we looked at the whole Maine coast there. And for Padilla Bay, we went, far beyond Padilla Bay and so on. So, I mean, we didn't look at the entire coast. They're not random samples, but certainly they extended quite a bit beyond the NERR boundaries.
Great, thank you. Somebody asked about whether we had developed guidelines for how to use these resources for restoration purposes. Laura made an initial answer in the chat or in the comment to the question, but mentioned that further development of such guidelines would be a great follow-up to the project.
That's a great point. In the technical reports that we prepared for each of the 30 reserves, we had a specific section on sort of implications for restoration, implications for conservation and restoration. And our team would sort of draft a little idea, and then we asked the point of contact to put that in context for their local issues. So at the local scale, we have some of that in there, but I agree that having like a bigger, I don't know, logic model or conceptual diagram that's broadly applicable could be useful.
Somebody asked about whether we used, a particular data set in a particular place that was different from NWI. Laura made the point in response that we wanted to use a consistent data set like NWI. Does anybody want to add anything onto that?
Yeah, at the very beginning, we had some pilot sites and we were trying to use very specific things. Like there's often habitat maps at the NERRs, right? And it was really cool, but it became a rabbit hole. And since we had to do 30 of these, there was no way we were going to be able to go to different data sets per reserve. The NWI was really the only way to pull this off across the whole system.
Yeah, the one exception for our sort of national synthesis was Tijuana River NERR, where NWI was so bad that we just couldn't use it. So that's the one where we used their local map.
So somebody mentioned a project that they had done that used historic mapping to help create hydrodynamic models and show that it had worsened. I guess that changes since those historic times had led to worsening flooding. So question is, are we planning to do any hydrodynamic modeling of these systems? Well, there's an open opportunity there apparently for anybody who would like to pick up our analyses and run with it.
Yeah, we're very, very tired from having done what we did across 30 estuaries, but it sounds like a great idea for somebody else to do.
Somebody asked whether, given the shortcomings of NWI, could this be an impetus to invest in an updated and more accurate effort from infrastructure funding, for example?
Yeah, and Laura can probably comment on this. She's been talking to the folks at NWI, and I've been communicating with them a bit. It sounds like in future renditions of NWI, elevation is going to be considered. And so the next set of NWI maps for our estuaries may be much, much better. We were working with what's currently available, but I think they're working on improving that product. And I know there's some NWI participants on, so if you want to comment on that in the chat or anything, go for it. I don't think you can speak out loud given the webinar constraints.
Somebody asked, what role did kind of steeper topography on the West Coast play in the greater loss of habitat there?
I'm seeing Paul Stacey's comment about Great Bay, and I think the lack of loss there was partly because it was this big basin and just sort of a narrow fringing area.
Okay, I've got a thought on this though.
Yeah,
I have sometimes wondered if the steep topography on the West Coast means that we've got fewer estuaries, and so they get more, you just get more people concentrated in fewer estuaries, and that might be why we have greater loss here, right? On the Atlantic coast, you just have that, more gentle shoreline, so there are more estuaries. So it just might be why we see that pattern. So a little philosophical, I guess.
Yeah, we have discussed amongst ourselves, why is there this vastly greater, almost order of magnitude greater loss of tidal marsh on the West Coast? And we have various speculations, but we'd love to hear yours too. I mean, they were more heavily converted to farmland. Is our farmland poorer in Mediterranean climates, or that's not the Pacific Northwest, but is there something where there's more ample farmland on the East Coast so you don't have to farm your estuaries? I don't know.
Somebody asked about how we were defining estuary in this project. Laura made a written answer to that, but if anybody would like to add their thoughts on that question.
I can actually talk now too. How exciting.
Great.
Yeah, Megan, thank you for asking about that. Yeah, we don't define the estuary based on salt. It's based on whether or not it has tidal fluctuation. And the boundary for that is it needs to be inundated by the tides at least once a year. And that comes from the hydrogeomorphic assessment framework. So it's also quite often used in state regulatory programs as a boundary. So that's our boundary, and that's where we got our elevation-based map from. So the annual high tide is another way to put it.
And was this the one that was asking about what we were pulling from NWI? I saw a question about that earlier. NWI actually has codes for estuarine, and so when we were going to NWI, we pulled out things that started with E for estuary.
Well, we also added in all the palustrin tidal, and so a lot of those are the areas that are these freshwater tidal up higher in the system. But yeah, I mean, the question of how you define the estuary is super important, and if different maps use different definitions, of course they're going to show different boundaries.
Somebody asked about what the amount of effort would be to do this kind of analysis at a new site. I guess assuming that the data exist.
I could speak to that. Charlie can say how long it took him, because he worked with the elevation data, and then Andrea could speak and Suzanne could speak to the historical part. But we do have some new resources now that might mean you don't have to start from scratch. And one of those is NOAA's high tide flood layer, which contains a minor, a moderate, and a severe flooding scenario. And the minor lined up really well with our annual high tide boundary, which makes sense because that's kind of what they're trying to get at with that high tide flood. So those data can just be downloaded and you have an elevational boundary that's very similar to what we did.
Andrea, you want to, or Suzanne together, comment on sort of how much going from T-sheet to GIS layer takes.
I'll talk about digitizing. She can talk about the analysis side because she had to do all of that, right? But I was really, so we started in California, and the T-sheets in California tended to be fairly simple, and you could digitize one in maybe a couple of hours. I was shocked when we started moving to like the Gulf Coast and the East Coast, and they were much more complex. So something I could do in maybe half a day at Elkhorn Slough would maybe take 30 hours. So it really depends on where you're at and how much detail is in your T-sheet in terms of just digitizing the habitat. Suzanne, you want to talk about what it took to analyze and compare
Sure.
things?
Yeah, well, it certainly helps that we've worked through the methods now, and so we have a framework to start with. But I will say that Lake Superior was probably one of the most challenging for doing the change mapping because it's not tidal. So Charlie, you might want to add to it how we kind of had to define what that area was that we were going to analyze and not incorporate the entire T-sheet area, just because it's not, there's no definition to, well, we're just going to look at the tidal wetlands.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, the freshwater only category in the Great Lakes was a challenge to work around. I encourage you, if you're interested more in the methods of how we are doing these things, that our February webinar will cover this more. But yeah, one thing I just do want to point out is it was an iterative process for all of these estuaries. So for a lot of these, we were creating models to run to do the geoprocessing. So now that we've got the models, we can run them a lot faster, particularly for the tidal wetlands. For any of the Great Lakes areas, it takes a lot more effort.
I assume
Well, I
some
see we're
people
at the top of
actually
the
put-
hour.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we're at the top of the hour. Sorry to jump in and cut people off. We blocked off an hour, so I see there's lots of questions, and I'm sure we had some that didn't get answered. So if you do have questions that you didn't get answered, or if something occurs to you after the webinar, please feel free to just follow up via the exit survey. It's a great way to make sure that the questions still make it to us, and we do read the comments, or at least I read the comments. So if you have feedback on the webinar series in general or the session, just feel free to pass that along as well. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I know it's a lot to jump on an hour block, but this, I think, was time well spent. I'm sure everyone would agree. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to our presenters for putting together such a great and engaging presentation. And we hope to catch you in the next one. Keep an eye out for the webinar summary resources. Those will go out in the email along with the exit survey. There should be a reminder email that goes out automatically tomorrow around the same time as the webinar started today. So the webinar recording probably won't be available for the next couple days, but look for it probably early next week. So thank you everyone for joining. Take care.